Alice was never one to do things by the book. As a kid, she'd been the type who tore through her science textbooks, not because she loved following instructions, but because she loved breaking them. Some kids wanted to be astronauts. Alice wanted to be the person who built the rocket. She didn't just imagine the impossible. She tried to make it happen. That's how she ended up in a lab at Crescent View Institute, fiddling with a machine that looked less like something out of a textbook and more like something that belonged in a B-grade science fiction film. It was a mess of wires, buttons, and an oddly glowing sphere at its center, humming like a distant storm. Alice wasn't about to explain it to her colleagues. Half of them were too busy dismissing her theories, and the other half were actively trying to get her thrown out of the lab for being a bit eccentric. But Alice knew better. She knew that time was not the unbreakable force it was made out to be. Time was like clay in the hands of someone who understood it. She just had to figure out how to mold it. The black hole engine, a device designed to manipulate spacetime, was her ticket. It was the culmination of years of research, powered by the most absurd and misunderstood scientific idea she'd ever had. What if she could create miniature black holes to warp the flow of time itself? At least, that was the theory. And the only way to test it was to turn the damn thing on. Okay, Alice. Let's see if you can make history, or if you'll be the one that gets erased, she muttered to herself, her fingers shaking as she flipped the switch. The engine roared to life. Lights flickered, the hum deepened, and the spherical core at the center of the machine began to pulse. The air around it shimmered, as if reality itself was bending, warping in ways Alice had only dreamed of. She leaned forward, eager to see the results, except nothing happened. Great. Another failure. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand and let out a defeated sigh. But as she turned to walk away, something strange happened. A brief flash of light, a ripple, as if time itself had skipped a beat, then the coffee cup on her desk exploded into pieces. And just as quickly, the pieces reassembled themselves, as if the laws of physics had decided to take a short vacation. Alice blinked, staring at the cup. Okay, not what I was expecting. Then she noticed something even weirder. Her reflection in the lab's glass window didn't move when she did. It stood frozen, mid-sip, while she reached for the control panel. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't an illusion. This was real. She stepped forward, and her reflection remained still, like an echo trapped in time. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. What the hell, she muttered, then snapped her fingers in front of her reflection. Nothing. Her heart pounded in her chest. Slowly, she looked down at her hands. She could feel the hairs on her arms standing up. She'd done it. She had actually, accidentally, but still, actually, done it. She'd manipulated time. Okay, calm down, Alice said to herself, pacing back and forth. Just, let's think this through. She looked at the wreckage of the coffee cup on the floor. In her mind, she rewound the sequence of events. The cup had shattered, and then, reformed. She stepped back, her mind racing with possibilities. I didn't just fix time. I made it go backward. Her fingers tingled with the power of the realization. She had just bent time, even if it was by accident. Her body buzzed with excitement. All those years of studying, all those hours of theorizing, and now, she was standing at the edge of something impossible, something no one had ever done. But then, there was another pulse. A shimmer in the air. Alice squinted, and before she could process what was happening, the timeline flipped again. This time, it sent her forward in time. She gasped, stumbling backward as she watched a figure appear in the doorway. It was herself, but not the version she knew. This future Alice had short-cropped hair and a tired, drawn expression on her face. She was holding a clipboard and had a look of frustration on her features. Is that me? Alice whispered to herself. The future version of Alice turned to her, surprised, as if she hadn't expected anyone to be in the lab. She looked at Alice in disbelief for a moment, as though scanning her face for recognition. Then, without a word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind only a faint trail of disturbed air. Alice's breath caught in her throat. The future version of herself had just walked past her like it was the most natural thing in the world. She hadn't even noticed her present self standing there. This was beyond what she had imagined. She wasn't just manipulating time, she was interacting with it. Messing with it, bending it, but as she stood there, staring at the door through which her future self had exited, she noticed something that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with excitement. The black hole engine was sparking, its lights flickering wildly. A strange sound began to emanate from the device, like a low growl. Alice's eyes widened in fear. She could feel the pull of something, an unseen force, tugging at the edges of her mind. The universe was protesting. She quickly rushed to the console, trying to stabilize the machine, but it was too late. There was a loud, explosive crack as something in the air shifted. The lab around her, her beautiful, meticulous lab, began to warp, the walls bending as if reality itself was coming apart at the seams. No, 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 no. Alice cried, scrambling to shut the engine off. But it didn't listen. It wasn't listening to her. It was making its own rules now. With a terrible lurch, the lab, no, the very fabric of spacetime, fractured. She could hear the walls of reality creaking under the strain. A ripple in the air expanded outward like a shockwave, disintegrating everything in its path. And as it did, Alice's last thought was a singular question: had she just broken the universe? Alice woke up to an empty lab. The quiet was suffocating, thick with the weight of something gone horribly wrong. She blinked, trying to clear the haze from her eyes. Her head felt heavy, as though she'd been caught in some kind of whirlwind, her body sore and disoriented. Her first instinct was to check the time, but as she glanced at the clock, her stomach dropped. The numbers on the screen didn't match any time she recognized. It was as though time itself had forgotten what it was supposed to be. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady, and looked around. Her lab was a chaotic mess, papers scattered across the floor, equipment toppled, cables severed. But there was something off about it all. The air felt stale, thick with the weight of lost moments. A sudden realization hit her. I must have done it, she murmured. I broke it. Her fingers trembled as she tried to activate the black hole engine again, but nothing happened. The machine was silent, inert. But in her mind, she could hear it, the echo of its power, the fractured whispers of the universe that had slipped through her fingers. Panic set in. She couldn't just stand there, frozen in time. She had to fix it, had to make it right. Alice took a deep breath. The only way out of this was to control the chaos, to find some kind of balance. She knew that now. But that balance had to come from somewhere. It had to come from her. She had to figure out how to put things back together, and so, she made a promise to herself. She wasn't going to break time again. Not unless it was the only way to fix it. Alice stepped away from the inactive black hole engine, her hands shaking as she tried to focus. It was all so absurd, so out of her control. She had spent years studying time, reading everything there was to know about temporal mechanics, yet here she was, standing in the wreckage of spacetime itself, knowing nothing. She wiped her hands on her lab coat, fingers still trembling. She needed to think clearly, but the anxiety was overwhelming, gnawing at the edges of her mind. What had happened? The rift she'd caused was no small thing. Time wasn't supposed to work like this. It was supposed to be a constant, an ever-present flow that couldn't be bent without consequence, but she had bent it, hadn't she? The proof was there. The future Alice, the cracked reality, the inexplicable void of broken time. Alice felt the pull again, a sensation that made her dizzy. There was something moving around her, like a shadow in the corner of her vision. She had to fix this. She couldn't just stand here, spinning in a broken moment. She needed to make it right, or at least stabilize it before everything collapsed entirely. She looked down at the machine again, but as her eyes fell on it, something strange happened. The machine, still silent, seemed to hum again, faintly this time. Almost like it was calling to her. The light from its core flickered weakly, then brightened and dimmed in rapid succession. Something inside her head clicked, and she knew that the machine wasn't just malfunctioning. It was reacting to her presence, as if it had somehow been bound to her. Alice approached cautiously, her mind racing through possible solutions. The first thing she needed was to figure out how to control it again. She placed her palm flat against the cold surface of the machine, her fingers brushing over the familiar dials and buttons, each one covered in dust and grease from disuse. She needed to re-establish some kind of connection, something to tether her to the machine's power before it completely spiraled out of control, but as soon as her fingers made contact, the air around her seemed to warp. She felt a jolt of energy surge through her, the hum of the machine growing louder, pulling at her thoughts like a magnet. For a second, Alice could see the world around her shift, the lab bending in strange, impossible ways, as if the room itself was folding in on itself. And then everything stopped, the machine fell silent once more, but Alice could feel the time rift in the air, its presence like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. The black hole engine had stopped, just like it had when she first activated it, before everything spiraled into chaos. But now, she realized, it was no longer just a machine. It was a part of her. The more she used it, the more it adapted to her, its power linked to her own emotions, her state of mind. Her pulse quickened. She'd been a fool. She couldn't just keep forcing things. The universe didn't work like this. She'd known the risks, but had never anticipated the sheer scale of the consequences. Time was fragile, and here she was, on the precipice of destroying it all. Alice's mind raced as she tried to consider her options. She could jump forward again, try to see what happened in the future and perhaps figure out a solution. But what if she only made things worse? What if every attempt to fix it only deepened the rift? No, jumping ahead was not the answer. She needed to stop using the black hole engine, to sever her connection to it somehow. But how? A sound broke her concentration. A soft creak from the doorway. Alice turned sharply, her breath catching. A figure stepped into the lab. It was her, again, but not the Alice she knew. This version was dressed in worn clothes, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with the same panic Alice had felt when everything first went wrong. Is this it? The other Alice asked, her voice hollow and full of dread. Is this where it all ends? What are you talking about? Alice took a step back. Who are you? The other Alice's lips twisted into a bitter smile. I'm you. I'm the version of you that couldn't fix it. The one who didn't get out in time. She glanced at the machine with a mix of reverence and fear. You don't get it, do you? You can't fix time. Every time you try, you make it worse. You can't undo what's already been broken. You're caught in the loop now. There's no way out. Alice shook her head, her mind spinning. I can fix it. I have to. I have to fix this. The future Alice stared at her for a long moment, the silence hanging between them like a dark cloud. Then, with a sad, resigned sigh, she spoke again. I thought I could too. But time isn't something you control. It's something you live with. You'll learn that soon enough. You'll break yourself trying to fix everything. Stop! Alice shouted, her voice cracking with frustration. She took a step forward, hands shaking with the weight of everything she was trying to understand. There has to be a way. I can't let it all fall apart. I can't let it all unravel like this. The future Alice remained still, her eyes hard as stone. Then what will you do, huh? Keep jumping, keep meddling? What happens when there's nothing left to fix? What happens when time just stops? Alice stared at the machine, the familiar hum of it now a low, ominous growl, as if it were mocking her. She didn't know what to do. The future Alice had warned her, but all Alice could see was the wreckage she'd caused. The rift was real. It was growing. And if she didn't do something about it, there would be no future left to save. A thought struck her. What if there was a way to undo the damage without erasing herself from the timeline altogether? She couldn't just let the black hole engine control everything. There had to be a way to reverse the rift. To make it right, to stop the fracture before it spread too far. She couldn't give up. Alice stepped back from the machine, her mind working at lightning speed, processing the calculations, the equations, the paradoxes that had all been flooding into her consciousness. She had to isolate the rift, sever it from the machine's energy. If she could manage to control the pull, the gravitational force, she could reverse the anomaly. It was risky, so risky that she wasn't even sure if it would work. But it was the only option she had left. Her fingers hovered over the controls, each one a delicate decision, each button a possible unraveling of everything she'd worked for. She adjusted the dials, shifting the balance of power, hoping that her understanding of the physics involved was enough. But as she made the final adjustment, a terrible, screeching sound filled the room, and the black hole engine surged to life again. This time, the room itself seemed to ripple, as if the very air was tearing apart. Alice didn't hesitate. She threw herself into the machine's center, pressing her hands against the core, forcing it to stabilize. Her body shuddered as the pressure mounted, as the time rift began to collapse inward. The space around her twisted, and for a moment, she could see it all, glimpses of past, present, and future, all bleeding into each other in a swirling vortex. Then, with a final, deafening crack, everything stopped. The machine fell silent once more, its humming fading into nothingness. The air felt still, the world around her solid once again. Alice collapsed to her knees, exhausted and shaking, but the rift was gone. The timeline was stable. She could still feel the weight of the consequences, though, like a heavy cloak draped over her shoulders. The future Alice had been right. Time wasn't something she could control. It was something she had to accept. But as Alice looked up, her vision clearing, she knew one thing for certain: she'd made the choice to protect time. And that was enough. Alice felt her chest heave with a mix of relief and exhaustion as the last ripples of spacetime faded away. The lab was eerily still now, the only sound the faint hum of the black hole engine, still dimmed but no longer a threat. Time felt normal again, linear, quiet, and contained within its proper boundaries. She stood slowly, her body aching as though she'd just run a marathon. Sweat slicked her brow, and her hands were still trembling from the force of her desperation. But as she looked around, she realized that nothing was as it should be. The machine was silent. That was the only word for it, silent. She couldn't hear the faint hum of its power anymore, the deep and constant rumble it had carried before, no matter how much she adjusted the dials. The black hole engine was dead. It was as if, in her final desperate act to control it, she had drained it of everything that made it work, and now it was just an empty husk, a relic of its once godlike power. Alice ran her fingers through her hair and took a few slow, deliberate steps toward the now useless machine. She couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow. All those years of work, all the theory and effort she'd poured into this project, gone. The machine had been her life's obsession, a tool she thought would revolutionize the understanding of time itself. But now, it was just a failed experiment. A catastrophe. Yet, deep down, there was still a part of her that refused to give in to defeat. She had done it. She had repaired the rift, stabilized time. Against all odds, she had fixed the most catastrophic error she'd ever made. She couldn't let herself forget that. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden whir of the door's hinges, creaking open. She turned toward the sound, a reflexive tension rushing through her veins. Standing in the doorway was the last person Alice expected to see. It was herself, but this Alice wasn't a future version, nor the one she had just spoken to. No, this one was younger, her face bright and full of possibility, as though she hadn't yet known the weight of all the time-shattering decisions Alice herself had just experienced. This Alice had that eager, wide-eyed optimism that came with first-year graduate students. The kind of optimism that Alice herself had long since buried under layers of skepticism and caution. The young Alice stepped into the room, glancing around, her eyes wide with confusion. I thought this place was empty. Are you the new intern? Alice opened her mouth but didn't speak immediately. She just stared at her younger self, taking in the fresh-faced innocence that seemed to radiate from her. She had to swallow the lump in her throat before she could respond. Intern? No. I'm you. The younger Alice frowned, tilting her head. Me? That's impossible. I'm not. She looked at the black hole engine, still dormant but somehow ominous in its stillness. Wait a second. What is this place? Alice didn't know how to explain. How could she? Her mind was still trying to process the kaleidoscope of temporal fragments she'd been forced to experience. The younger Alice hadn't even been born when the machine was first conceptualized. She shouldn't have been here. And yet here she was, a glitch in the timeline, walking into the very lab Alice had just saved. The older Alice struggled for the words. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't have seen this. Seen what? The younger Alice's gaze flitted nervously over the machine and then back to her older self. What did you do? What happened to the lab? Why is everything broken? Alice couldn't answer her. Not directly. She had spent too much time already playing with the rules of time. To explain the gravity of what had happened would only risk unraveling the fabric of reality again. And yet, she realized that this moment, this meeting with her younger self, couldn't be ignored. If the younger Alice stayed here, if she somehow became involved in what had already transpired, it could create an entirely new kind of paradox. The sound of her younger self's voice, full of curiosity, echoed in Alice's mind. You shouldn't be here. But that's when it hit her. The younger Alice wasn't the one causing the issue. She wasn't even supposed to be a part of it at all. The timeline had already been altered once. Maybe twice. But if Alice didn't fix this new fracture, things could escalate again. You can't stay here, Alice said, her voice firm, even though the words sounded hollow in her ears. This isn't your time. The younger Alice blinked, looking bewildered. What do you mean? I'm just doing research. I haven't even started yet. I don't know what this machine is, but, no, Alice said, cutting her off. You're not supposed to be here. You can't. A surge of panic gripped her chest. The lab started to blur at the edges of her vision, and the world around her seemed to tilt on its axis again. She could feel it, the pressure, the tugging sensation. Another rift, another distortion in time. But it wasn't just the lab now, it was both the lab and her younger self, both of them bound to the same moment. Everything was coming undone again. No, 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 Alice whispered, the reality around her warping in slow motion. The younger Alice remained frozen, unsure of what was happening. Then it happened. The younger version of Alice took a step forward, oblivious to the impending collapse, and everything shattered. The lab around them fractured into a blur of overlapping time and space, like a broken mirror. Alice tried to grab her younger self, but it was too late. The younger Alice's face twisted in confusion as the edges of the room blurred. Time itself seemed to tear apart, splitting into fragments she wasn't even sure existed. The edges of the black hole engine pulsed like a heartbeat, and Alice could feel the machine thrumming beneath her fingers as if alive once more. She realized the truth too late. This wasn't just about fixing time. This was about controlling it, restraining it. Every action she took, every moment she altered, reverberated across the fabric of the universe, leaving cracks in its wake. She had become a part of the machine, a gear in the cosmic clock, and now, that clock was ticking faster, more erratically than ever before. Stop! Alice screamed, reaching for the black hole engine. She slammed her hand down on the activation button, hoping to stabilize the rift, but as she did, everything turned white. There was a sudden, deafening silence. Alice blinked and rubbed her eyes. The lab was quiet. Completely still. Her mind reeled with the realization that she wasn't in the same place anymore. She had moved, shifted again, but this time, there was no chaos. No distortion. The lab was peaceful. Slowly, she turned around, and for the first time since everything had started to go wrong, she found herself standing in a future version of the lab, a version she recognized. One where everything had gone right. The black hole engine was neatly calibrated, the equipment was undisturbed, and there was a calm certainty in the air. And then, standing before her, was her future self. Not the worn, broken version that had warned her. This Alice was whole, centered, calm. The future Alice smiled softly. "You made it, didn't you?" Alice swallowed hard, her heart heavy with both triumph and sorrow. "I think I did." But the future Alice's smile faltered. "You know it's never truly fixed. It's only a temporary solution. Time is fragile, and you can't keep bending it forever." Alice nodded slowly, a faint understanding dawning on her. The rift was healed, for now. But it wasn't the end. Time would always be an enigma, something to be studied, but never fully understood or controlled. "I know," she whispered. "But maybe, just maybe, I can live with that."